So now for the real beginning of the obesity section. Obesity is simply defined as an excess in body fatness. These are microscopic pictures, a microscopic image of fat cells. Obesity by major medical organizations is now classified as a disease, a medical condition. I'm part of an eating disorders group, and they do not like that obesity is now considered a disease because they think that adds to the stigma. Because I have a clinical background, I have no problem with that. I have no problem with the fact that diabetes, which is, characterized by high blood sugar, is a disease. I have no problem that obesity, which has physiological origins for a lot of people, is considered a disease. So what is obese? Well, BMI of over 30 is considered the cutoff for obesity if you're using BMI as the classification. If you're using percent body fat, it's 25% or more percent body fat for men, 32% or more for women. But remember, like we talked about earlier, you have to consider when you're looking at, excess body fat and health risks, you have to look at body fat distribution as well. And we talked about that previously. Now, let's look at obesity trends. I have the advantage of a lot of life experience, so I've seen this happen over time. So this first picture is the percentage of people with a BMI of 30% or greater throughout the United States. And the light blue is 10 to 14% of the state's population having obesity. The darker blue is 15 to 19%, and the very light blue is less than 10% of the state's population had obesity. There are some states that didn't track it at that point. Now, let's look, that was 1991, and that's when, Arnold Schwarzenegger was named, president of the Council on Physical Fitness and for the United States. And I remember he put out a video for the war on obesity in around 1990. So look at what's happened since then, okay? So we have a lot of blue states here, not in the political sense, but if you look at you can see that an a vast increased number of states 5 years later had an obesity prevalence of 15 to 19%. And then there are no very light blue states at that time. There seems to be this swath in the middle of the country, or in the kind of western half of the country, midwestern half, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana. And one of my friends from Colorado joked that, that's a really lean part of the nation, that swath going from north to south. But, these BMIs were self-reported, so maybe, they just lied more. That's probably actually not the case if you visit those states, though. I just thought it was funny. So you can see by 2003, we had to add more colors. Now there's no states that are light blue. The leanest states had 15 to 19% prevalence of obesity. Most of the states had 20 to 24%, and there are a few states that had more than 25% of the population obese. Oops. Then by 2008, there's only one blue state left, and that was Colorado. And I have lived in Colorado a couple times for grad school, and then from 2008 to 2013. And Colorado takes a lot of pride in the fact that they're the leanest state in the nation. But if you look at them, 15 to 19% obesity prevalence, they're where the states with the highest prevalence of obesity were in around 1991. But you can see that now we have a lot of states that have more than 25% obesity, actually. So this is this was 2011. They changed the color scheme because of the changing obesity. So now Colorado, as of 2011, Colorado even had more than 20% of the population with obesity. And then there are a lot of states with 30 to 35% prevalence of obesity. So this is 2014. Now we have some states with over 35% prevalence of obesity, more and more with 25% to 30% obesity. And this is the latest graphic that we have, just published in 2020. And you can see that obesity is increasing even more, the prevalence of obesity. Here's some overweight trends in different countries, and you can see that U.S. is leading, but in other countries, obesity seems to be increasing worldwide. Among children, you can see that obesity has been increasing. When I was a kid in the 70s, only about 5% of kids were overweight or obese. Unfortunately, I was considered one of them until Marcy Nobleman moved into town, and she was the other kid who was big in my class. So you can see that the prevalence of obesity has been increasing over the years for kids as well. Interestingly, even though childhood obesity is more prevalent, obese children rate their quality of life at the same level as kids with cancer. So, you hoped that the self-esteem issue that comes with childhood obesity would be better if they had more company, but it's actually not. So this is the data, the most recent data from 2018. The prevalence of obesity, 18.5%. And remember, it was, like 5% in the 70s. So obesity started increasing with the change in food policy and the change in food environment. If you want more information on the change in food policy that's related to this, there's some good documentaries. But in the 80s, we were still thinking that most of obesity was explained by genetics. And then all of a sudden, obesity started rapidly increasing. And the gene pool doesn't change that fast. So it was a change in the food environment. The increase has started to slow down, but it still is increasing. And what's really alarming is the number of super obese people, that's a BMI over 45 to 50, keeps increasing. When I first started out as a dietitian, it was very rare to see someone who weighed over 300 pounds. But now that's actually quite common, and we're seeing people in the 400 and 500 pound range increasingly. So about the latest data, again, I had to revise this slide for this presentation because I used to say 2/3 of Americans were overweight or obese, but now it's 70% of Americans are overweight or obese. That should be overweight or obese, and 42.4% are considered obese. It used to be about 1/3. So there he's walking across the slide. So the complications of obesity, that's the concern about obesity. Now this is a super obese person. I think this was a guy that there was a show about. I think a long time ago, he's passed away, but I think he weighed about 1,200 pounds when this picture was taken. But when I'm talking about the complications of obesity, they start occurring with BMIs over 30. And again, remember from the previous lecture, you can't have excess body fat and be fit, but there are complications that start occurring as the level of body fatness increases above a BMI of 30, especially for people who carry abdominal body fat. So first, psychosocial problems, and this is very real. There's an increased risk for depression partly because of the obesity bias. There's a lot of low self-esteem and lack of self-worth among people with obesity. There is documented social and economic prejudice. There's a pay differential, and there is a stigma about being obese that leads to psychosocial problems. Increased risk for cardiovascular disease, hypertension, high blood lipids. Now that doesn't mean that everybody that if you're lean, you can't have high blood lipids. I called it hypercholesterolemia here, but there's a lot of lean people who have that familial hypercholesterolemia that we talked about earlier in the semester, genetic high cholesterol. It's kind of dangerous, but I've seen some people who are lean just assume that they're not at risk for cardiovascular disease. When I was a dietetic intern, I observed an open heart surgery, and the guy was very, very lean. He had a quadruple bypass operation. So just because you're lean doesn't mean you're protected against these things, but the obesity does increase your risk. For the high blood pressure or hypertension, when you have more body mass, more pressure has to be created in the circulatory system to pump blood through that extra tissue. Increased risk for stroke, increased risk for arthritis because of the increased pressure on the joints. Increased risk for certain cancers because fat tissue is not just a storage of excess energy. Fat tissue actually produces hormones and inflammatory factors, and one of the hormones that fat produces is estrogen, and there are some estrogen-sensitive cancers. Increases risk for GI problems, not just gallstones. I should have added that it increases the risk for fatty liver. It's called hepatic steatosis. Increased pulmonary problems. When you have a lot of excess body fat, especially in the abdominal area, it can get to the point where it makes it difficult for the lungs to expand and to get a good breath. Increases risk for skin problems. There's a condition called acanthosis nigricans, and actually one thing that is glaringly missing on here, and it's ironic because I'm a diabetes educator, is increases your risk for type 2 diabetes. It's people with type 2 diabetes who are obese that often get that acanthosis nigricans, which is a dark pigment that generally appears especially around the neck. And then other hormone imbalances. So I'm going to stop there for this video clip and talk about the reasons for obesity in the next unit.